Hi, OpenXML developers. This screencast is part 2 in a two-part screencast on keeping metadata with content items in OpenXML word processing ML. In the last screencast, I first described the problem about maintaining identity around content items in a word processing document. And further, once we have maintained identity around content items, being able to keep metadata associated with all of those content items. I showed how we're going to use field codes to annotate every paragraph in the document such that when a paragraph or other piece of content is cut and pasted from one location to another in the document, we can understand what happened and therefore maintain identity and maintain the metadata. I also showed how we are going to have these field codes point into a custom XML part that contains some XML that is indexed by that field code ID that we saw in the main document part, and we're going to put all of our metadata in the custom XML part. And by doing this, we impact the main document part as little as possible. We can put as much XML as we want to into that custom XML part. Finally, I mentioned how we're going to always keep revision tracking turned on or change tracking turned on, and we're going to lock it because we're going to use that revision tracking markup along with the field code markup to figure out what editing actions the end user took on the document, and therefore we can then deduce exactly what the identity of every content item is in the document and what the metadata associated with that content item is. Well, going in and looking at the markup for those field codes, that's a little bit cumbersome. If you're debugging a process associated with this, you don't really want to be going in and showing field codes and figuring out what the field code ID is, that integer that follows the comments type in the field code, and then going into the custom XML part and finding that item in the custom XML part and making sure that your identity is maintained properly, and also making sure that your metadata appropriately follows all of these content items as the user does their various editing operations on the document. Well, I've put together a little program that what it does is it opens up the main document part, it grabs each field code, it figures out what the field code ID is. In other words, this 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are following the comments type of the field code. It then goes into the custom XML part. It finds the appropriate field code element in that custom XML part, and then it inserts that XML into the main document part with a small font and with a highlight so that we can easily see the metadata associated with our content items in our document. So let's see what that looks like. The example in the project that you downloaded that contains all of this code, it contains this IdentityManager example. And this IdentityManager example, what it does is it iterates through all of the docx documents that it finds in the directory that contains the project, and it does three things. First thing it does is it converts this main document, this edited document, to another version of the document where we can see the custom XML markup in the main document part. It then performs identity management on the document and does all of the resolution of identity of this document. And then it finally runs that processed version of the document through the debug processor so that we can see exactly what identity is maintained and what the metadata is. So let's run this example. We can see it processed every document in that folder. And here we can see that there are now 4 documents where before we had this 00 test source.docx. And this was the document that we saw that has revision tracking turned on, and it has all of the field codes in there. We can then look at test source debug. And here I'm going to zoom in so we can see in a better way. We can also see the custom XML markup. Up here we can see that there is this F element. This is the one that we saw in the custom XML part. We can see that the item is a paragraph, and we can see that the item exists, and we can see its ID is 1 up here, 2 here, 3 here. Again, this is 1. So this is the paragraph that was moved from here to this location. We can see that the field code ID is 1 up here and it's 1 down here. We can see that the content item ID is 1 up here and it's 1 down here. And we can see up here we had the metadata test data, ABC equals 1. And down here we can see the moved to metadata of test data. Now, if we look at test processed, we see a document that has no revision tracking. If I go to the review tab and tell it I want to find the next tracked revision, there are none. So in other words, what this document does is it does do the process of accepting tracked revisions, but in addition, it does extra work in there so that we maintain identity and maintain our metadata. And finally, if we look at test processed debug, we see now what it looks like where we have moved that metadata in the custom XML part and styled it with a small font and put that content in the main document part. We don't ever really want to use this document for anything really. We're just using it to understand what the idea of maintaining identity for all of these content items is, and seeing that we are, in fact, properly moving the metadata from one location to another in the document. One more thing to explain about this debugging program is I added an example here called Debug Custom XML, and this Debug Custom XML is a bit of code that you can also use in your development process. And what it does is, as delivered, it takes this test document that is in the same location as the C# program and in the same location as the Debug Custom XML CS proj, and it adds that styled content into the document. So if I come over here and I right click on Debug Custom XML and I go to the Debug context menu and I tell it I want to start a new instance. So this is just running that Debug Custom XML. It asks me what document do I want to process, and yes, I want to process .././test.docx. It asks what the destination document should be, and test-debug, that's fine. And it asks what the name of the field code element is, and in this case, F is the name of the element. I've parameterized the identity manager so that you can name those elements and attributes in the custom XML part. You can name them whatever you want. I've picked very short names because I found that that's easier to debug when I am taking all of that custom XML markup and inserting it into the main document part as styled content with the very small font and with the yellow highlight. So I'll accept that the name of the field code element is F and the name of the ID attribute that matches up to the field code ID in the main document part, and that attribute name of ID is fine. What do I want for the point size of the inserted XML? And 6-point font is fine. It's a small font and we can see that. So now let's go look at the result. Here's our test-debug. And what that did is that took the document that I just showed to you and it got the XML from the custom XML part and it shoved it in here into the main document part so that we can see exactly what is going on. And this is crucial to being able to explain what the identity manager is and what it does and how it maintains identity throughout the process of the end user editing this document. So let's close that down. And now let's start examining various examples of how the Identity Manager works. So the simplest case is where we delete and insert a paragraph. You've seen this. Here we have a paragraph up here. It has comments 1 as its field code, and we cut that paragraph from that location and we inserted it at this location down here. If I look at the debug version of that, we can see the yellow 6-point text in there. Now, if I look at the processed version, I see a document that has those field codes in there, and we can see it goes field code 2, 3, 1, 4, which is what we expected. And this document has no revision tracking in it. And finally, if I look at the debug version of that, I can see that 2, 3, 1, 4, I can see this XML from the custom XML part here and see how that XML moved and followed that content from the location where it was cut at the top of the document and pasted further down in the document. This even works in the case where a paragraph is moved and modified after it's moved. So let's look at this. Here is a document where the first paragraph up here was cut. It was then pasted 2 paragraphs down, and then after pasting, the end user inserted some text at the beginning of that paragraph. If I turn off the showing of the field codes, it looks a lot more like a normal document. We can see that the paragraph was copied, it was pasted, and then some text was inserted down here. And now I can look at the process debug version. And in the process debug version, we can see that the first paragraph now in the document has that field code ID of 2, and it has the content ID of 2 here also. And then the next paragraph, it has a field code. Now the field code is no longer at the beginning of the paragraph, but that is really irrelevant. We can just find the field code in the paragraph wherever it is. That's straightforward. And we can also see that the text that was inserted is inserted, and even though that text was inserted, that second paragraph maintained its identity and maintained its metadata. Example number 3 is another case where there's more modifications to the document. So for instance, up here, there is deleted text in paragraph 1, but that paragraph should maintain its identity even though that text has been deleted. The second paragraph has a word inserted into it, and that shouldn't affect its identity at all. Then we can see that this paragraph, the fourth paragraph, has been cut and pasted and thereby moved from that location in the document to a location further down. And also the fifth paragraph has been deleted and not inserted anywhere else. And if we look at the processed version of this, we can see that the first paragraph, even though it had deleted content, it still maintains its same identity. It has the same field code ID and it has the same content item ID. The second paragraph, even though it has a word inserted in it, it still maintains its identity. The third paragraph is as it was. The fourth paragraph has now been moved further down in the document. We can see the field code ID of 4 and the content ID of 4. The fifth paragraph is just completely gone. So the field ID is gone, the content ID is gone, the metadata is gone. If you want to understand that a particular paragraph has been deleted, what you do is you look at the before version of the document and look at the after version of the document, and you can see which field codes have been deleted by comparing those custom XML parts, and thereby you can understand that that fifth paragraph was deleted. Example 4, what we have is a case where the user completely deleted a table and the paragraph following the table, and then they inserted that table and the paragraph following that table further on in the document. If we look at the debug version, we can see that the table has an ID of 1 and the various rows have their IDs. The paragraph following that table has an ID of 18 and the paragraph has an ID of 40. We can see down here where the move to table is and the move to paragraph following that table is. We can see where those are. Let's close that and let's look at the processed version of that. And in the processed version of that, we can see that the first paragraph in the document has a field code of 19 and the content item type of 41, and the next one has content item type of 42. And now we can see our table down here, and we can see that the table has an ID of 1 still, and it has its appropriate row IDs and paragraph IDs. And if we drop down to below this table, we can see that the paragraph following the table has, as we expect, the field code ID of 18 and the content ID of 40. That's what we expected. Now let's look at the case where a row was cut and pasted in a table. So let's look at the source document. Here we have this first row. It is cut from the first location in the table and it's pasted down into the next to the bottom location of the table. It has this content when you click on online video. Let's look at the source debug version. We can see that the table has an ID of 1. The row, this first row that was cut, has an ID of 2. The cell has an ID of 3. The paragraph has an ID of 4, and so on. And we can, of course, see all of that in here down below. Now, you'll see that before the Identity Manager processes this, the table content ID is inserted down here at this location further down in the document. But what the Identity Manager understands is it understands that this is going to be the case when you have cut the first row in a table and pasted it elsewhere in the table. You'll have that field code there twice. No big deal. The Identity Manager can figure out exactly what happened. And when we look at the processed version of this, we can see that, in fact, the table still maintains its identity of 1. We can see the first row now has its identity of 10, and the cell has its identity of 11, and so on. And when we look at the second to the last row in the table, we can see that the row has an identity of 2. In other words, the content item identity is 2. It has its cells and they have their identities and the paragraphs have their identities. And so everything has been put back in the form that we can use very easily to figure out what content has which identity and metadata associated with it. By understanding all of the revision tracking markup, plus the existence of those field codes in the document that has revision tracking, we can put everything back into its right place using the Identity Manager module. So the previous example showed what happens when you cut and paste a row. It also can happen that you can move a row. So here we have the second row in the table has been moved to the next to the last row in the table. If I look at the debug version, the second row, it has a row identity of 10. Now let's look at the processed version. And we can see that the second to the last row, it has a content item ID of 10. And everything else is maintained as appropriate. Example number 7 shows what happens when you have a row that has been deleted and inserted multiple times. So here this second row has been cut and then it's been pasted into the same table. Let's look at what the debug version looks like, and here we can see that the second row with a row ID of 10 has been cut and it's been pasted 3 times. So we can see that each one of these rows as inserted has the row identity of 10, but this is not correct. We know this, and the Identity Manager will deduce this. It knows that this first case of the row with a content item ID of 10, this is the one that was actually moved, and the following two are inserted rows. So when we look at the processed version of that document, we can see that row 10, it's gone from the second row in the document. We can see it down here. It's now the third row in the document, and it has the row ID of 10. And we can then see that the next two rows are notated as inserted. They have a field ID, but they don't have a content ID. Instead, they are denoted as inserted. There's no metadata associated with these rows because the metadata is associated with this other row with a content item ID of 10. And these two rows do not have any metadata associated with it. This is the rule of this identity manager, is that if content is inserted into a document, we can see that it is inserted, and we can see that it doesn't have any metadata associated with it. We can find out what its field code ID is, but it doesn't have a content item ID, and it doesn't have any metadata associated with it because that content is newly inserted. We've talked about paragraphs, we've talked about tables, we've talked about rows, and by extension, we've talked about cells and the IDs of each of those cells that get cut and pasted or copied and pasted. We can now talk about lists and list items. The simplest case here is the case where a list item is deleted from one location in a list and inserted elsewhere in the same list. So here we can see that this item number 2 has been cut from that location. It's been pasted into the same list further on, and we want to understand that that list item has been cut and pasted from this location to this location. And now let's look at the document after processing. And we can see that this second list item has been moved further down in the list, yet it has the same content item ID of 5. So even though it was cut and pasted in the new document, it has the same content item ID. If we look what happens when we've inserted a list item, here we have a document where there's just a new item called added item in the document. If I look at it after processing, we can see that this list, it still has the same ID. The first item in the list has an ID of 4. The second item in the list has an ID of 6. And the third item in the list has the notation that it has been inserted. And the fourth item in the list still has its content item ID of 8. So the same principle applies. The paragraph and list item have been inserted, and therefore they are denoted as such, and they don't have a content item ID. And if you were putting metadata on any of these content items, there would be no metadata associated with this newly inserted list item. The last example is we're going to see what happens when we completely delete and insert a numbered list. So in this example, we can see how the entire list up here, items 1, 2, and 3, have been inserted down at the bottom of the list, and you can see that they now have items 4, 5, and 6. This is an artifact of how Word shows this. If I were to go into review here, first I would have to go to restrict editing, turn off restrict editing. If I were to go in here and accept all changes in the document, you can see now how that list at the bottom of the document has items 1, 2, and 3. I'll close this and not save it. And now I'll look at the debug version of the processed version of that list. And we can see the content up at the top of this document. It now shows that the list is gone from that location. And down at the bottom of the document, we can see that this list is here. It still has its ID of 3. It has its content item IDs of 4, 6, and 8. It has its same paragraph IDs of 2, 5, and 7. so everything looks as we expect it to look. So in effect, what we've really developed here is a new, fancier version of Revision Acceptor, and this fancier version of Revision Acceptor expects to have these field codes at the beginning of every single paragraph in the document. It expects that revision tracking has been turned on, and after this process has been run, we can go in and find out the identity and the metadata associated with every content item in that document. In the download zip that you got here, in this test documents folder, there are 91 separate cases. You're free to go in and look at any one of these cases here. In this particular case, the paragraph mark at the end of this second list item has been deleted to make just a list with 2 list items in it. If I were to look at the final markup, not final showing markup, we can see that there are just 2 items in this list now that the paragraph mark has been deleted, thereby creating 1 list item out of those 2 paragraphs. There are a lot of different cases here. I was pretty careful. I believe that I have handled every single case that can occur. In addition, in the download zip file that you got, there is a folder that has all 91 documents as I expect that those documents should be after they've been processed by IdentityManager. If I come over here and I run this IdentityManager project, it has IdentityManager test.cs as its source file. I'll debug and start new instance. What you can see is it's running IdentityManager on every single one of those cases and validating that the main document part is as it expects it to be, and that the custom XML part is as it expects it to be after processing by the IdentityManager. I know this is a lot to take in. At the high level, what we can think about is that we now have a way to store metadata with any content item in a document and let the user edit it. And after the user edits the document, we can go in and process the revision tracking markup and reestablish identity and reestablish the metadata for every content item in that document. That's what to retain at the high level. There's a fair number of moving parts in this, but it's really not that complicated. And in fact, what happens is that the IdentityManager module does all of the heavy lifting for you. In the project that you downloaded, there is another example here called Insert IdentityManager Field Codes. And this will take a document that you have created through some form or another, and it will insert all of those field codes into the main document part, and it will insert boilerplate custom XML into the custom XML part. And further, you can then, after running this code on a document, you can go in and start adding your own metadata to that custom XML part. That will be the topic of another screencast in the future. I expect that this module is going to be of deep interest to about 3 or 5% of OpenXML developers and will be of only passing interest to a large number of developers. If you're interested in just generating OpenXML documents, then this module probably isn't so interesting to you other than from an academic point of view. But if you are someone who needs to integrate Word into a larger process where you want to query an underlying enterprise application or an underlying line of business solution, and you want to enable end users to modify this document such that you're going to maintain this metadata through the process of the end users modifying this document, then the IdentityManager is going to be useful to you. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.